Welcome to Perspectives with Mzu.
Welcome to part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Thabi Leoka, looking at the economy, institutions, and leadership. Welcome back, Thabi.
Thank you.
We'll pick up where we left on the role of SOEs and especially DFIs such as your land bank and others. I share your view that these institutions are not geared to support new set of entrepreneurs, largely Black entrepreneurs, because they still use the risk models that are applied by the traditional banks. And one of the features of Black entrepreneurs is that they don't have access to social capital to raise a skin in the game. And some do, but not to the extent that, for an example, you would have with white-owned businesses. So they don't have homes that they can use as collateral. And many of them are first-time homeowners. So a home is really a sacred asset for them. And they can't go to a village or to a township and say, hey, I'm starting a business. Can you please come and join up with me? Because in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in the context that they come from, people are still at the base. And if you say, I want to start a business, they look at you as crazy. And Black people have to rely on government, by and large, as that social capital, as it were. And I think institutions such as the Land Bank, DFIs such as your IDC and others are really missing an opportunity to create something that's never been created in South Africa. Yes, you are going to make a loss on a whole lot of Black South Africans. But if you are experimenting, if you're thinking in multi-generational terms, you also use the lending process to learn lessons about the type of entrepreneur that you're dealing with. You are constructing a future. So you're not just dealing with the present or hopping on to a path-dependent sort of mode of supporting or financing entrepreneurs. So you've got to break the mold and do something more innovative. So do you have more to say there?
Yeah, you are correct that, these DFIs have not done much in terms of, or done enough in terms of investing in entrepreneurship and South Africans who are interested in entrepreneurship. There's always a risk in investments. You know, what breaks my heart is when I see, during the financial results of the traditional banks.
Yeah.
And when I see that the debt that has been written off, the hundreds and millions, and I often think that money, if you had invested in half that money or quarter of that money in Black entrepreneurs, at least it would have gone to, that's a future investment. Versus your, millionaire or billionaire or multimillionaire that you've invested in and defaulted. And the same argument I have for the DFIs, if you don't want to invest in your people, that means that, or in South Africans and small businesses, that means that you don't trust them.
Exactly.
Because you wouldn't then see them as a risk. Because that's so negative. You want to either help someone come up with an idea. If you can see that this person obviously given, and everything is within context. Our history obviously didn't equip many people to become bold thinkers, creative. And maybe they do have an idea, but they don't know how to put together a business proposal. And I'm told by many people that people fail at business proposal level, not at their idea generation and execution. It's at their writing a proposal that makes, sense and that is sound for the recipient at these DFIs. So help them, that can't be the first stumbling block. That can't be the first no. Help them put together a business proposal and help them through with their business, because there are many things that they may not understand. But conversely, there are many things that you may not understand about their business because they're operating in an environment that they know. And it goes back to the apartheid South Africa and township business people. They didn't have to go through writing business proposals. They had their businesses without loans. They had their businesses without this. So they understood the demand, they understood the supply, which is basic economic concepts. And they understood that this is what I need to sell. This is the quantity that I need to sell. This is the demand that there is here. I need to be at this corner rather than that corner, because people walk here to go get the taxis to go to town. And whereas the other way around, then taxis don't go there. So those basic things are business concepts, are a business proposal. Another thing is, if you look at countries, especially the Asian countries, that they invested a lot, the banks, especially the government banks, invested a lot in entrepreneurship. And that's why a country like South Korea has these big family businesses. That's because the loans were extended to these families and support was given to these families. If we look at South Korea in the 60s, they had very few companies. It's an astonishing country for me. And every time I use it as an example, you get people who say, oh no, but then, it had a dictatorship. You can have the success without the dictatorship.
You can, yeah.
And because it's not the political dictatorship that we want. It's we want to learn from them in terms of how they invested, how they grew their businesses. Yeah. And we don't have to have someone who will have a militant view in terms of how to govern the country in order for us to achieve these things. So something as basic as getting DFIs to invest in its people, having DFIs and the state to protect these young entrepreneurs and ensure that they do not fail.
Yeah, I think we should demystify the idea that South Africa or any country needs a dictator to move forward. Because if you look at countries that have been run by dictators, only a few of those countries progressed. I mean, Africa is a laboratory of dictators, and it's
even
not...
Asia. Even there's only a few. So in Asia, there's maybe Indonesia. I'm sorry, there's South Korea and Singapore.
Yeah.
That are the two examples of countries that had successful stories after a dictatorship.
Exactly.
But
so we take exceptions.
Look at Vietnam. Look at, there's so many other countries there that are Colombia. I want to say Colombia, it's not Cambodia.
Yeah.
It's also another example.
Yeah.
You can argue that the military rule in South America also didn't come up with or create very prosperous, stable economies there too.
I mean, these are really exceptions, and also the value about one of the most important things about freedom and sort of democracy is the comfort that when a ruler, first recognition that a ruler is not infallible and that they are human and that they can get into erroneous ways of doing things, and we should be able to remove them. In a dictator might start off well, but may down the line realize that, this is my fiefdom, I will do as I wish. How do you remove them? So I think, we should get out of this mind. We don't need it. I think we have institutional mechanisms that allow us to develop as a country and that allow us to keep those in power under check and keep them accountable. So there's nothing that constrains us from driving economic development.
I think what we need, what is important, is, and that could take the place of this thinking of having that a benevolent dictator always comes up with a great success story, is that if we had a vision.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the NDP was supposed to be that vision. But if we, as a country, collectively, regardless of creed, religion, race, all of that, if these are like the 10 principles of South Africa, and where we want to see ourselves in 100 years' time or 50 years' time, then regardless of who is in power, because the whole point of the whole why people romanticize benevolent dictators, because that person follows through, is the only person that can have certain policies that will be actualized, versus having a 5-year or 2 terms and then maybe a political change, or you have a rogue president, and then that means that, you know, it's a stop and start kind of democracy.
Yeah.
But if we had this one vision, regardless of who comes in, we all know that these are our guiding principles as a country, and this is the where we want to be. And everyone, regardless of which political party they come from, understands the national vision. I think that would help.
I think that's lacking. I mean, that takes us to the next conversation, which is, I've noticed when we're living under this sort of dark moment of, I would say, call it sort of the lost decade, the dark decade in South Africa's politics and sort of economy. When we're living under sort of Jacob Zuma's moment, we almost had a consensus in our outrage against corruption, poor governance, and so we majority across race, across parties. Well, of course, the ANC was muted about its positioning because this was the president and so on. But generally, there was a groundswell of opposition to that political situation. And, you could just meet a stranger at a bus stop or in Gautrain and say, hey, but this Zuma president is taking us back. And you would all be in agreement. However, post-Zuma, when our dialogue shifts towards questions around socio-economic inequalities, the idea that we should be united in tackling socio-economic inequalities, we should be united in redressing the imbalances created as part of the social legacy of apartheid. We should be speaking with one voice on land reform, and that the fact that you have 10% or so of the land owned by the minority, and the Black South Africans don't own much of the productive assets in South Africa. That you could get onto a Gautrain, talk to a white counterpart and say, hey, we really need to accelerate this land redistribution. We don't have that kind of energy. Instead, we polar opposites. We go into our own holes and we throw stones at each other. Why are we finding it hard to have a galvanized sense, sort of a broad front as South Africans to tackle things that are so obvious? Why are we so comfortable with squatter settlement that lie across Sandton, that lie across Constantia, or that lie across Blowback Strand in the Cape, or that maids or gardeners are typically Black, and figures of authority in society are whites, and this is the state. This is a convention. We're comfortable with it. Why are we not finding discomfort in these divides?
So, firstly, I think that with the Zuma era, I'll use myself as an example, and my friends will vouch for me for this, because I was against him. Yeah, I think in 2005. Not just in the past years where the madness escalated. And the reason I was because of the way he conducted himself prior to becoming the president. And I felt that he represented a lot of the issues and problems that we have in our country. Yeah. From, relationship with, from the Kwesi case, which is a huge problem in South Africa in terms of race and misogyny and, the way men treat women, to all the cases that were related to the Shabir Sheikh, the racketeering, money laundering and all that. So for me, he was a scary figure from the start. And I just felt that South Africa was just so sacred that it can't be led by such a person with all that baggage.
Yeah.
And I was amongst many, many people, the solo voice. What protected me was that I was living in London for 10 years. So I could use at that time, before Twitter, it was all Facebook. I could use Facebook to vent at my utter disappointment and disgust. And so by the time everybody got mad, I was tired of being mad. My anger towards him had just, I was defeated. You know, I'd done it for the past decade.
Yeah.
So I was silently watching everybody capitulate. And I thought, finally, he had to go this far for people to react. And you're right that we started having this common disagreement, and even with our members of his own political party, it took them a long time until it affected them personally, until it compromised them personally, until they had to make a decision personally between either being corrupt or being with the president. So I think that we need to think about how those years developed and how we got to where we are, and how we're responsible for where we got to where we are. Looking forward into the things that make us angry. And it's the next stage. I think the first one was the last 10 years was, the disappointment of the 10 years that we had, or the 8 years that we had, where, a lot was promised and very little was delivered. But now we have issues which are real to us, things like land. And it's very sad to, even with me, it's interesting when you see the things I comment on social media, on Twitter, and the more neutral things, the more things like looking at the government and talking about the recession or inflation or something, talking about the
exchange rates, maybe. Okay.
Everybody seems to be okay with that from all different racial groups. And I didn't want to talk about land because actually I didn't understand. I wanted to give myself time to understand what it is that we're doing, what it means, what kind of land. And so as I was reading comments and listening to Wandile Mhlobo and listening to Tembeka Ngqikaitobi and listening to a few people, Professor Ruth Hall, listening to a few of them talk about it, then I thought, okay, this is obviously something that needs to be done. I was a big fan of the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, and when he talked about land and having surety and how it will help eradicate poverty and give the poor agency and allow them to own businesses on the back of their property. And I thought, wow, this actually makes sense. So I looked at land within that context and in the South African land debate within that context. I also look at land within the context of the cost of transportation, the spatial development, the fact that we still have apartheid spatial development, and the fact that I live in an apartment, so the fact that my own helper lives in Tembisa and has to go to Alex and then come to Sandton to come to where I live. By that time, how much money does she have? And she has 4 children. And it just didn't make sense. And having also another experience that I had is that living in London, I lived in Notting Hill, and which is a relatively affluent area. And they had council houses everywhere. Yeah. You have council houses in Chelsea, Kensington, Notting Hill, everywhere where the rich live. You have also council housing. What it did is that it brought safety because there were a lot of people walking around. I mean, in London, a lot of people walk, but there was a diversity. Otherwise, it would be lily white living in London. You have all these different interesting characters from East Europe, from Africa, from Jamaica, who lived in a certain block of apartments, but they brought about a dynamism that wouldn't have been there. It didn't devalue the property. There was no increase in theft. And I feel like if we had used my actually, after thinking about it, I thought, why do we have golf courses in our suburbs, in the center?
Yeah.
And if you look at big cities elsewhere, globally, they're all out. I lived in London. I couldn't have pointed.
I couldn't see it.
I've never
by
seen
the way,
a
even
golf
in
course.
Geneva, I spent time there. You have lots of public parks.
Yes,
Lots
public
of-
parks.
yeah.
But also I thought to myself, why don't we either convert them into public parks and also convert our golf courses into low-cost housing areas so that people live amongst us, like we live amongst each other as an integrated society. What this will do is that our restaurants, where the kitchens close at 9 and people have to now leave restaurants at 10 and 11 because and restaurants close relatively early compared to the rest of the world because people have to travel very far to go back home. And often restaurants have to pay for that transportation because there's no public transportation at that time.
Yeah.
Imagine if they lived nearby and they walked.
Yeah.
And so now you'd have restaurants closing very late. We've got great weather, especially in the summer. You can have 2 slots where restaurants, have their first slots from 8 to 6 and then 6 to 12, for instance, or whatever the way they want to break it up. So you've got they're employing more people. Our malls close early for the very same reasons. Our malls could close late. I don't understand how a mall could close at 6, where I have to then come from work and have to buy groceries after 6. And then you have to go look for a place that is open, that opens till 7, and it's a rush. If it closed at 9, then you have the evening slot of workers who then live around. That
Also for their safety,
malls,
because some walk quite a long distance from where they work to catch the late taxi.
Exactly. And so I also find Johannesburg, if I compare it to other places that I visit, it lacks a bit of soul. Like when I go to New York, I just have to close my eyes and the smell, the people, the noise. I feel like I'm in a
There's
big
life,
city.
Yeah.
When I go to Hong Kong, it's the same. It's just got that buzz. People are pounding the pavements, going up and down. There's an energy. There's life.
Yeah, but
Here,
I think it's
6
also...
o'clock, dead.
It's dead, yeah. I think it's also a question of values. It's what we value as society, because people will
But
tell
we're
you
not
that...
like that as people. If you looked at, again, think about how we grew up.
I know, but
in the townships or in the villages, it was very different. It was communal. It was, there was energy. People walked up and down. People screamed across the road.
Yeah.
There was a pulse.
Yeah.
And I just
But
feel
in
like
terms
this is
of,
a big city that doesn't have a pulse.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're right. In terms of social integration, this is
Completely.
imaginative what you're talking about, and this should be our conversations instead of having these gated,
and we don't understand each other. You're right about social integration, social cohesion as well, which is very important, and it then will lead to. We're having these discussions because we are territorial. It was, so when I first came back from London in November 2011, so I came back home, I remember writing an article about gentrification and talking about exactly this conversation. And this was on one of the radio stations. And people called in and they talked about not only the prices of their property going down, and this is all races, by the way.
Yeah.
It just worried me. The people were fearful of their area.
Yeah.
And this is the debate with also the land issue. People are fearful of they think that land will be their Bryanston house with the pool and the tennis court will be taken away from them.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be taken away from them. We're just going to share. And I always say to people, what embarrasses me about SA, and I've got a lot of friends who live all over the world, but especially my rest of Africa friends who have never been to South Africa for the first time, and I always invite them over. I've got friends from Guinea, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and I've always said, come visit me, come visit, please, please, please. So they come here and they stay at my place, and then I take them out to restaurants, and it's just white people and us. And then we drive around, it is just white people and us. I take them to Maboneng. There's a few, there's obviously a different culture there, a lot more integrated. Take them Arts and Main, very white. And then they come up with this idea of, so South Africa is a bit weird. Where do black people live? And it's almost like, but, it's so embarrassing. How do you explain that? And I know exactly what they're asking, because the roads, you can walk through the suburbs and walk through the avenues, and it's just no black person in sight or black people living there, and it's cold.
Yeah, and it's normal. It's kind of, we've made it so normal.
Normal.
And it's not normal. It's not normal, because the normality, or rather the what is normal, should be integration. And I think it's a mindset. Because people will tell you, not in my backyard.
And that's why people are all upset. It's like you're encroaching on my backyard. You're encroaching on my space. You want to take my land.
There was a time back at the varsity days. If you go to, because UCT was located within a suburb. There's history to that, and for Black students were starting to stream into UCT, so in the 80s, 90s. I mean, even after sort of apartheid, they would battle to find accommodation around, say, Mowbray, Rondebosch, Rosebank, Claremont. So if you, as a black person, you call a place that was advertised in the newspaper, then you're told that it's taken away. And then people started to play this game where they will ask their white friends after they've called, and the white friend calls, and then the place all of a sudden is available. And you also saw it in restaurants, by the way. And there are a lot of stories that I think things are changing somewhat, but the attitudes and the mindsets are still, there's a lot that we need to do as society, because it's also about enlightened self-interest, especially for white folks, in allowing integration, because it's about the security of their children, of their grandchildren in future.
But what is threatening? I think that, there is the word security of, and how you term security of their future, their children in their future, it's similar to that racist Greek guy, or that racist guy that went to Greece. It's almost like there's a threat of blackness.
Yeah.
The beach is peaceful and beautiful because it doesn't have black people. And you see, like, there are times where you travel, especially you go to like your Nice now, your Plet, and I just think to myself, wow, this is like, it's like Switzerland. It's like a village in Europe, or Sorrento in Italy. And it's just so purely white. Like, it's peaceful. Like, I just think, not that it is actually peaceful, that these guys are just living in their enclave, which is unnatural.
Yeah, exactly. So
it's
the
so
point,
unnatural. And the land issue is, I always remind people, there are 4.5 million white South Africans. Does it feel it? It feels like there are 30 million white South Africans, not 4.5. So when you talk about land, it becomes emotive because it's possession. People feel like you're removing something from them. You are taking their purity, their space of peace. And maybe if you read the comments on Facebook, on Twitter, which are horrible, you think that you're almost making the place dirty.
So the point I want to make is that I think it's selfish to want to live an unreal life today as a white person in South Africa, because whether you like it or not, your children will grow up in a different South Africa. You rather prepare them for now. You rather work hard to change your attitudes and to model a different reality to them for their own resilience, and also just for them to become better human beings, psychologically, morally, and emotionally in a changed society that is, they don't carry the excesses of your baggage into a future that may just very well be unforgiving of those attitudes. And one thing I like about South Africa, it's a very noisy democracy. We all have opinions, and we, unlike other societies, perhaps, where something like this, you look at Brazil, the divides are sort of buried there in silence, and if you are black, you know your place. In South Africa, it's not going to happen, and our children, they go to better schools than ourselves. They become a lot more conscious of race issues and they call it out. And so I think we can start now to change mindsets, to change conversations, to seek to understand more than to want to influence the direction of the debate in ways that sustains the status quo. Because when people, for an example, attack the whole land reform issue, what they are saying effectively is that we want the status quo to remain, because they don't put forward any alternative along the lines of shared wealth, shared assets, or equitable distribution of opportunities and wealth in society. So they want their comforts to be, their comfortable spaces to be left intact.
Yeah.
And so
we didn't have reparations in South Africa, and I think this is one way of doing it. What is also very interesting is with expropriation without compensation, it's actually in the Constitution. The Constitution that everybody was singing and dancing around in 1994, everyone of all races. So to come back and say, no, you can't, it's expropriation without compensation that we're against. It's the without compensation. I don't understand it, but it was always there. We all were signatories to this constitution, right? Yeah. We all lauded this constitution.
Maybe we'll pick that up in another debate, in another discussion. But I want your views on sort of the role that the private sector can play to contribute towards transformation and change. And I'm asking this question because, people, it's easy to blame the state. Even on, say, the land issue, people will say, but it's the state is inefficient. We can fix the inefficiencies, we can fix the institutions, but would you then be ready to be part of a compact for redress, for redistribution, for equity? Because it's not the first time, say, with the land issue that there has been a backlash, especially amongst the white community. But if you look at all the equity policies from affirmative action, it used to be caricatured, to be ridiculed. People would say, well, now we are asked to appoint a one-eyed Black woman who sits on a wheelchair. It's sort of as a very crass way of... and at work, employees would be told that, look, we can fire you, go to Mandela to ask for a job. I mean, these were things that were said.
Yes,
these are not fictional stuff. So we can talk about the inefficiencies of the state. They are there. The institutions have been badly damaged. But that's one part of the story. There's a bigger story, which is the social legacy of apartheid that has not been addressed, that has not been touched at all. In South Africa, white people live better than they would ever live than anywhere in the world, with a mass of maids, garden workers, and sort of cushioned behind high walls and so on. So there's more to fixing institutional capabilities. There's more to building a thriving society, a healthy, thriving society, than just merely building, fixing these institutions. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There's much more work to do in overcoming the historical legacy of the past, in overcoming mindsets, in creating real opportunities for those who are on the margins of society, who tend to be Black. Now, is there a role for the private sector to create to be driven by a new imagination and to create real change in society?
I think now more than ever. And I say this because if you look at the constraints in government, especially financial constraints, it is quite clear that the private sector needs to step in. And we need to see more private-public partnerships in economic, development, in the form of infrastructure development, in the form of maybe schooling, fixing the education system, fixing the health system, etc. I often say to companies that, and I think to many people, but mostly to companies, that you you think you're doing well now. Your balance sheets are looking very healthy, but you're doing so with a country that is bumping along at the bottom.
Exactly. Yeah.
With unemployment rate that is 37%. And you are doing well. Imagine if if unemployment rate was at 10%, if the economic growth was growing plus 5%. Now imagine how well you would have been you would have done as a business, as a company. So I think there's a lot of short-termism, and obviously there's a lot of companies have made a lot of money in post-apartheid South Africa. But I think that now is the time to invest in South Africa. I think a lot of companies have left politicians to do what they do, left the politics to become erosive.
Sure. Yeah.
And in some cases, yes, you've seen people speak up, but they've spoken out alone, and they were ostracized alone. And there was no support from business to say, actually, this is what we've been saying. We've been we've been saying the same things in our dinner parties. We've been having the same conversations in our boardrooms. We support Mr. XY or Mrs. XY or Miss XY for saying this, for making this point. But I think that a lot of people who were vocal were ostracized and without the support of corporate SA until such time where I think the politics became so bad that it impacted on business operations and on revenues, and then they started waking up a bit and having these groups and these business organizations started becoming a lot more vocal. I think it was too little, too late, and business is part of this democracy. Is a shareholder, a significant shareholder of this democracy. So I think that they should own it and be responsible in the ownership. Being responsible is, again, like the land issue. You cannot have a company in South Africa that doesn't reflect at least the demographics of the country.
You can't. I mean,
it just doesn't seem right. Another shock in terms of visuals for me, coming from London, working at Barclays, and then working in South Africa, and either working for my own companies that I work for or the companies that I visited, the demographics were worse than companies in London.
Sure.
Where they don't need to have, a certain percentage of Black people there. It's natural for them to appoint people of color. Whereas here, it doesn't seem natural. I also don't, how do you run a business where you don't have senior Black people in the context of South Africa?
Well, let's say the private sector is allergic to diversity, maybe.
No, but South Africa that we have if you are going to engage with government on certain issues, those issues, when said by certain people in a privileged position who happen to be also white, they don't translate as well when versus when that same thing is said by a Black person to government.
Yeah, but I think, Thabi,
I always say that. I just think, but okay, so I think it's difficult for you to have that conversation as a white person to come, because it just doesn't come across the right. It just doesn't come across well.
But I think the point to emphasize that you made earlier on is that companies need to be diverse because it's the right thing to do.
It is the right thing to do.
Because, what they've done, many companies, they've done all sorts of creative. They've used energies in a wrong way, where they would appoint Black people to be head of government, public affairs, so that they can deal with government. Mining companies do this, banks did this, everyone does it. Similarly, fronting. I mean, fronting still happens today.
Huge. So when I said interacting with government, so I don't mean it in terms of the fronting way or at public relations level.
Roles.
Especially when we had a rogue president.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
it would seem very weird to have the top 20 companies in
all
South
white.
Africa, all white, one coming together to speak to government about the problems of politics and
fully
how
agree.
politics is
The
impacting
legitimacy
on government.
is important. Yeah, fully agree.
I would also think, okay, you're a group of people who are untransformed, who are speaking. So there, as a rogue president, there are so many things that I can attack you guys on because of the way because of your composition, rather than what you're saying. And so then it becomes difficult to have that discussion. Whereas when you are transformed and reflect, you then are not, you don't appear as if you're representing a certain type of person. When you are a group of transformed people who reflect the country, then you sound.
You have legitimacy.
Yes, you have legitimacy. So you come across as if you're representing all South Africans. Fronting is a huge problem. I worked for a company that had all disabilities you can think of for 3 months, and I did report them to the DTI, and I don't know what happened afterwards. But for 3 months, they had all these disabled people, and this was the 3 months before the cutoff for before the new BEE. Legislation came in. So then they used these guys for point system, and then as soon as they had their BE guys to look and rate the company, that company then did away with the disabled group of people that they had there that they used for fronting. Fronting in the country is illegal. There are fines for fronting, and yet I guess the state is not ensuring that this doesn't happen, and is not also fining companies, because if companies were fined, then they would not do it.
And it's arrogance. I mean, corporate South Africa it's arrogance. It's to break the laws deliberately and to find creative ways around regulation. It's actually to put up a middle finger against this government and against people who should be beneficiaries of equity. It's callous and arrogant. I think government needs to. I agree with you. Needs to go hard. Last question, Thabi. We've spoken a lot about the economy, the institutions, the private sector, the character of our society, race relations in our society, and then that was not part of the script, but I quite enjoyed it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's part of our reality in South Africa. Now, the last question is on the role of leadership in mobilizing positive energy for change, socio-economic change, and nation building. How much of a role and of a responsibility does leadership, political leadership in particular, but also business leadership in harnessing and nurturing positive change in society?
Very important question. Leadership, I think the older you get, the more you realize that the way you conduct yourself when you occupy a certain position has an impact on others.
Yeah.
And by conducting yourself, I'm the least conservative person. So, if you want to wear your hot pants and your little top and on a weekend and walk around Hyde Park, I have no issues with that. But where I have an issue is when a leadership or a leader has a following.
Yeah.
And you have to be exemplary.
Exactly, yeah.
And especially a leader that has been elected by the people. And unfortunately, if you are a person who doesn't understand the role of a leader and doesn't understand that a leadership role requires you to conduct yourself in a particular way, then don't go for certain roles in society.
Yeah.
I think that a country is how its leader is.
That's well put.
A leader is a mirror of the country.
That's well put.
And when you have a leader that is rogue, that doesn't follow the rules, that enables corruption, or that is corrupt, it then creates a society that is a reflection of him. A society that doesn't follow the rules, a society that is corrupt, a society which can do anything that it wants because it knows that there are no consequences. And so it becomes very difficult then to move from one way of doing things and then to adjust to a different way of doing it. I remember when, for instance, when Nelson Mandela and when Thabo Mbeki were presidents, when they walked into a room, you naturally
Feel their weight.
And you sat up. You didn't slouch, and you sat up. And you kind of want a leader who you respect in that way. Where he walks into the room, he has an aura. You know that when he opens his mouth, it's going to be brilliance that comes out. Do you want to aspire to be like him? When I was at university, I wanted to become a president because the president to me was Nelson Mandela, and he was a president at that time. And I thought that it was such an easy job because he made it seem so easy. He was smart, well-read, and Thabo Mbeki, same. And obviously that I'd never want to become a president because I think that there are presidents that have been less exemplary. We have Trump in the US, for instance, and others everywhere else in the world. And as a result, they allow for a social decay in society. And that social decay is going to be very, very difficult to rectify.
Wow, very profound. I will not add anything to what you said. It's I just wish we could have in future a separate podcast just on leadership. Your endpoint is just so beautifully crafted, and I fully share that perspective. I always thought that I was kind of a traditionalist or conservative in believing that leaders actually played such a powerful, influencing role on social norms and in the vitality of their countries. So we'll end our podcast there. Thank you so much, Thabi. This was lovely. It was really great, enriching, insightful. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to Perspectives with Mzu.